In the year 1914, deep in the hollows of Appalachia, the mountains held a secret that no one dared speak of. They rise like walls of stone and shadow, hiding valleys where sunlight rarely reaches, where the wind moves through the trees with voices that seem almost alive. On Goins Ridge, a narrow trail led to a clearing so isolated that even the bravest hunter would hesitate to cross it after dusk. That night, a deputy carried a lantern across the frost-cracked earth, the glow trembling over roots and rocks, as though it sensed the weight of what lay ahead. The cabin loomed in the clearing, built of logs blackened by years of smoke and rain, silent except for the creak of timbers shifting in the cold. And inside, in the smokehouse at the edge of the property, the earth under the floorboards seemed to hold a presence, something waiting in the darkness. The deputy lifted the first board, the nails whining softly as they came free. Light spilled into the narrow space, revealing cloth folded in ways that had no business being there. Beneath it, pale shapes pressed against the soil, bones delicate and fragile, and a hand, impossibly small, curled as if reaching for something it would never touch. He could feel the weight of years pressing down from the ridge, pressing down from the mountains themselves, and for a moment, he could not breathe. For 14 years, the ridge had kept its secrets. The trees, the rocks, the hollows, all had seen and heard what the world refused to acknowledge. Tonight, for the first time in a generation, those secrets were rising into the light. And tonight, we follow them, into the shadows that the mountains themselves tried to keep hidden. The mountains of Appalachia are patient observers. They have watched centuries pass, streams carve the valleys, and the forest reclaim what was once open land. But they also remember the footsteps that vanish into the hollows, the whispers that never reach another human ear, the lives that end quietly, where no one will ever look. Goins Ridge rises from the western slopes like a natural fortress. Its cliffs and hollows twist in ways that confuse even those who know the land, and the dense woods swallow sound, light, and warmth. Trails that appear on maps vanish within a mile, swallowed by undergrowth or winding into creeks that carve their own labyrinths. Few ventured there, and fewer returned with more than uneasy tales to tell. It was here, in this hidden hollow, that the Goins family had chosen to live. A widow, Eliza Goins, and her 3 sons, large men who moved through the woods with a familiarity that seemed impossible to outsiders. The cabin they built was isolated, sturdy, and careful. Its walls were made of logs blackened by years of smoke. Its windows were small and shuttered, almost as if the family wished to hide from the world entirely. The clearing around it was orderly, as though nature itself had been disciplined into obedience. It seemed like any other homestead from afar, but the air was different, heavy, quiet in a way that pressed on the chest. Even the wind seemed reluctant to pass through the ridge. Those who did stumble upon the property noticed strange things. Hunters reported the 3 sons watching from the tree line, motionless as statues, their eyes fixed on strangers long after they had gone. Travelers would mention hearing chanting or murmurs in the woods, but no one could be sure whether the sounds were human or carried by the wind through the pines. The locals whispered about the family in hushed tones, but most kept their distance. The mountains were already dangerous enough. The Goins property added a different kind of threat, one that was difficult to name and impossible to measure. Even the paths leading to the ridge seemed unwilling to be followed. Rocks shifted, streams swelled without warning, and the forest closed in, turning a 10-minute walk into an hour. In this way, the ridge protected itself, as though the land itself had taken sides. For those who lived in the hollows below, the Goins family was a shadow on the mountains, a presence that everyone knew to respect and everyone hoped to avoid. And yet, the shadow was not empty. It carried secrets older than the trees, waiting for the right moment to be uncovered. Tonight, we begin our journey into that shadow. We will follow the ridge, the cabin, and the family into the moments that the mountains held close for 14 years, until the day the secrets could no longer stay buried. But before we begin, like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. The mountains are patient, but we'd love to hear from you before we descend into the horrors that await. Now step carefully, because the forest listens, and the ridge remembers every footstep that crosses its hidden hollows. The story of the Goins family begins with a loss so sudden, it left the hollows of Appalachia colder, emptier, and quieter than the mountains had known before. Samuel Goins, the father, worked in the mines that carved through the hills, a man as strong as the timber he fell, and as steady as the handrail on the mountain trails. But in the summer of 1878, a shaft collapsed, taking his life and the lives of 3 others in the dark earth below. The community mourned briefly and moved on, as the mountains demand. Life continues, and tragedy is swallowed by the daily grind. But for his widow Eliza, the earth had changed forever. Left with 3 sons too young to fend for themselves, Eliza became both mother and father, but also something more. She was a woman who understood the strength of the mountains, the way isolation could shape a family, and the quiet power that comes from living where no one watches. The boys, Caleb, Josiah, and Benjamin, grew up under her gaze, their world reduced to the narrow clearing, the cabin, and the surrounding forest that stretched in every direction. School was abandoned. Trips into town stopped. The boys learned the language of the ridge, its sounds, its paths, its dangers, before they learned the language of other people. To outsiders, the family was invisible. Eliza appeared in town only occasionally, dressed in black, her posture rigid, her face unreadable. She spoke little, and when she did, her words carried a weight that people instinctively respected or feared. The boys followed her silently, their presence commanding attention even without speech. Hunters, surveyors, and passers-by soon learned that the clearing was private, and the ridge did not forgive intrusion. Those who wandered too close returned with nothing but vague stories of strange eyes in the tree line, of a cabin that seemed too still, too perfect, too removed from the world to be entirely human. As the years passed, the family receded further into the mountains. The boys grew tall and broad, moving through the woods with an uncanny knowledge of every slope, every hidden path, every hollow where the sun did not reach. Eliza became the center of their universe, her words shaping every decision, her presence filling every corner of the cabin and the ridge. Visitors, if any appeared, were met with watchful silence and a warning glance. The mountains seemed to echo their isolation, and the forest around them thickened, as if guarding a secret that the world was never meant to see. And the secrets were not small. Objects appeared on the ridge that did not belong, small traces of lives outside the mountains, left behind in the hush of the clearing. Travelers disappeared quietly, without struggle, and the local families, accustomed to hardship and the dangers of the woods, whispered only in private. The Goins family existed as part of the mountains themselves, as though they had been born from the hollows, raised by the ridge, and meant to remain untouchable by the world beyond. It was a quiet horror, not of violence at first glance, but of control, of devotion, of a family shaped entirely by isolation. And in the stillness of the forests, in the silence between the trees, the mountains waited for the moment when the secrets would no longer remain hidden. In the mountains, time flows differently. Days bleed into nights. The light shifts through the trees in ways that confound the senses, and the hollows seem to hold their breath for weeks on end. It was in this space, where the shadows lingered longer than they should, and the wind carried voices that could not be placed, that the first disappearances began to haunt Goins Ridge. The world outside the ridge moved on, as it always does, but those who knew the high trails understood that something had changed. The first man to vanish was Martin Hayes, a geological surveyor sent to map the ridges for a coal company. He was methodical, cautious, and unfamiliar with the secret ways of the mountains. His letters, once reliable, stopped arriving. His absence stirred little more than a murmur at first, because the mountains had swallowed men before, and it was easy to assume that Hayes had fallen, lost his way, or simply chosen to vanish. The hollows offered countless explanations, none of them satisfying, all of them possible. Weeks became months, and the ridge remained unchanged, silent, unyielding. 4 years later, a traveling preacher named Jacob Whitmore disappeared in the same stretch of mountains. He had moved from homestead to homestead, bringing scripture, blessings, and kindness to families who had no church for miles. Whitmore was seen walking the narrow trail that led to Goins Ridge, Bible tucked under his arm, sun glinting off the spine. That afternoon, he was swallowed by the trees, and no sound ever announced his passing. Search parties found only twisted roots, rocks shifted unnaturally, and the whispering wind. No evidence of struggle, no signs of injury, nothing except the hollow certainty that the ridge had claimed him. The local families spoke in hushed tones about the disappearances. They said the Goins family were peculiar, though no one could explain what they meant. Some claimed the sons moved with a weight in their steps, as if the earth itself bowed to them. Others told of glimpses of Eliza standing at the edge of the forest, her arms outstretched in quiet command, eyes like lanterns that could pierce the soul. Hunters and travelers reported hearing murmurs that seemed to drift through the trees, indistinct words in voices that were not quite human, but also not quite alone. The ridge was alive, the mountains observing, and the family existed as part of the landscape itself. By 1908, 5 men had vanished along the ridge, all in ways that defied explanation. Surveyors, preachers, itinerant workers, and travelers, all drawn to the mountains, all disappearing into the hollows. Each time, the community offered explanations. Missteps on rocky paths, sudden illnesses, animal attacks. And each time, the mountains whispered differently, as if reminding the world that the truth would not be found so easily. Sheriff Thomas Compton, a man of decades of service, noticed the pattern. But the mountains were vast, the ridges tangled, and the people below wary of intrusion. Those who lived closest to the ridge had learned that curiosity carried a cost. Yet the sheriff, old and patient, could sense that something existed in the heart of Goins Ridge that was neither natural nor easily understood. And still, there was no proof, only the absence of men, the weight of silence, and the subtle movements of the family within the clearing that made the air itself feel thick. Locals spoke of the suns in the shadows, of their strange rituals glimpsed only from a distance, fires in the hollows, chants that echoed faintly through the treetops. the glint of eyes that did not belong to men who lived in the light of day. But fear kept people away, and the mountains reinforced that fear. The forest closed in around those who dared approach. Mist filled the hollows and trails, masking roots and rocks that seemed to twist beneath every step. No one ever saw the disappearances happen. They only felt the absence afterward, a void in the rhythm of life, a quiet that pressed against the chest and made the heart race. And then came the whispers, carried by the wind to those who dared to listen. Travelers spoke of fleeting glimpses of movement within the cabin windows, of shadowed figures standing still as statues, of fires burning briefly and then vanishing without smoke. Some swore they heard voices speaking in low tones, as if rehearsing words that were older than the mountains themselves. These were the earliest warnings, faint and easily dismissed, but they were warnings nonetheless. They told of a power within the ridge, a devotion to an order that was unseen yet unyielding, a family whose control over the land and its secrets seemed absolute. The disappearances, the shadows, the whispers, they were not random. They were deliberate, carried out by hands trained in obedience, by minds that understood the mountain's language, by a family whose devotion to each other had become something more than human. And though no one below the ridge could understand it, the mountains themselves seemed to approve, hiding the horrors within their folds, until the day when the secrets could no longer remain in the dark. This is the ridge that held its breath for 14 years, the hollow where the boundaries between family, faith, and obsession blurred, and where the silence spoke louder than any words ever could. And now, for the first time, we begin to uncover what it has been guarding all this time. Time moves differently on Goins Ridge. The seasons pass, but the world beyond the mountains continues on its own rhythm. Here, in the narrow clearing and dense forest, the rhythm belongs to the family. The boys, Caleb, Josiah, and Benjamin, grew not as children of the wider world, but as children of the ridge itself. Their legs became strong from climbing steep paths, their eyes sharp from reading the shadows in the trees, their ears attuned to every sound the forest could make. Every movement in the woods, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch became part of their understanding, part of their instinct. Eliza, their mother, watched them as both guide and commander. She was patient, exacting, her gaze assessing every twitch of muscle, every hesitation in thought. The boys learned to obey without question, to see her word as law, to feel her presence in every corner of the cabin and every shadow in the forest. There were no arguments, no rebellion, only the steady imprint of a will that had shaped their lives from the moment they could walk. The mountains themselves seemed to bend to her authority, the forest deepening and closing around the clearing, as if sealing the family from intrusion. The cabin, once a simple home, became a place of rituals and repetition. Meals were prepared and eaten in silence, chores performed with exacting precision, the order of life dictated by the quiet hand of Eliza. Light barely penetrated the shuttered windows, and the smell of smoke and wood lingered in every room. Each day mirrored the last, and the forest beyond the clearing seemed to press closer, wrapping the family in isolation, shaping them into creatures of the ridge, as much a part of the land as the trees and stones themselves. The sun's presence alone was enough to unsettle those who ventured too close. Hunters reported seeing them appear suddenly at the edge of the forest, as if the shadows themselves had taken shape. Their eyes, dark and unyielding, followed intruders for long moments before retreating. Their voices were rarely heard outside the cabin. Their movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic. The family existed in a rhythm separate from humanity, a quiet that carried the weight of obsession and devotion. To step onto the clearing was to step into a world governed by rules no one else could understand. A world shaped by the will of one woman and the unbroken obedience of her sons. Neighbors, distant and careful, told stories of the ridge with a shiver. Some claimed they had glimpsed figures in the cabin windows at night, standing perfectly still, watching the moon move across the sky. Others heard low chanting, fragments of words that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. Travelers who accidentally approached the property found themselves inexplicably lost, wandering paths that should have led directly to the main road, only to emerge hours later, shaken, their sense of time twisted by the hollow corridors of the forest. The mountains held them close, as if guarding the secrets of the family, as if the ridge itself approved of the way the world had been kept at bay. The boys, as they became men, carried the mark of the ridge on their bodies and in their minds. Their shoulders were broad, their hands skilled, their movements almost inhumanly precise. But it was their eyes, unflinching and constant, that most unsettled outsiders. Eyes that had been trained to watch, to obey, to anticipate. Eyes that reflected the weight of a mother's command and the isolation of a childhood spent entirely within a single clearing in the forest. Caleb, Josiah, Benjamin. They moved as one when necessary, silent and careful, like predators shaped by circumstance rather than nature. The forest had made them, but Eliza had shaped them into something else entirely. As the years passed, the ridge grew quieter in a new way. The disappearances continued, though less often. The locals assumed that intruders had learned to respect the boundaries. The forest thickened, the trails narrowed, and the cabin sat in its clearing like a monument to a world apart. A world built on isolation, devotion, and a hidden, unspoken hierarchy. Inside those walls, Eliza's influence remained absolute. Every thought, every action of her sons was a reflection of her will, a testament to the strange order that had taken root in the mountains. The ridge itself seemed to pulse with her authority, a living, breathing extension of her mind, and the boys had become its guardians. In the quiet moments, when wind barely stirred and snow muffled the forest, one could almost hear the rhythm of the cabin. Footsteps on wooden floors, the soft scraping of chores, the whisper of a mother's voice repeating instructions that had been etched into the sons' minds over years of solitude. The mountains held the sound in their hollows, letting it echo endlessly for those who were willing to listen. And in those echoes, the ridge told its story, a story of obedience, of isolation, of a family that had become a part of the land itself, waiting, always waiting, for the moment when the outside world would finally trespass. It was in this silence, this unbroken order, that the ridge waited for the first sign that the secrets could no longer remain buried. The forest, the mountains, the cabin, the family, they were ready, each playing a part in a story written over decades, a story that would one day come fully into the light, a story that no one who stumbled upon the clearing would ever forget. Spring arrived on Goins Ridge in 1912 with a quiet persistence, the kind that presses life back into the mountains after a long, grey winter. The snow melted into the hollows, streams swelled, and the trees began their slow, patient ritual of green, returning to the ridges. Life beyond the mountains seemed to move faster, unaware of the pulses of time in the hollows. And yet, even as the world outside prepared for planting and trade, The ridge remained itself, unchanging, watchful, patient. It was during this season that Edmund Pierce, a traveling salesman from Richmond, made his way into the western slopes. He was a man accustomed to journeys, to paths both known and unknown, and he carried with him a wagon full of tools, household goods, and the unshakable confidence of a man whose business relied on the trust of strangers. He had traversed the mountains before, but he did not yet understand that Goins Ridge was not a place for casual passage, and that the forest and its guardians measured intentions with precision. Pierce's route led him along familiar trails, past scattered homesteads, through pockets of civilization so small and isolated that mail arrived once a week, and news trickled in like thin water through rocks. The salesman was greeted politely, offered directions, and warned only vaguely about the ridge at the end of the trail, a warning he would later recall with unease. The sun began its slow descent as he approached the clearing, the air cooling, the shadows stretching across the forest floor in long, dark fingers. From the edge of the trees, the three sons watched, still as carved statues, their eyes reflecting the dying light like dark mirrors. Pierce, oblivious to the attention, approached the cabin with the practiced smile of a salesman, tipping his distinctive brown bowler hat to the forest as though greeting a partner in trade. The clearing seemed unusually quiet. Birds that should have been calling from the trees were silent. Even the wind appeared hesitant, whispering through the pines in muffled sighs. When he stepped closer, the first signs of abnormality became clear. The cabin door stood slightly ajar, but the clearing bore no evidence of ordinary habitation. Tools were in place, wood neatly stacked, and the ground showed no recent footprints aside from his own. Suddenly, movement. The youngest son, Benjamin, emerged from behind the cabin, repairing the fence along the trail. His shoulders were broad, his hands thick and calloused, and his eyes, dark, unflinching, fixed on Pierce immediately. For a moment, the salesman felt a jolt of unease, as though the air itself had thickened. He waved politely, expecting acknowledgement. Benjamin's lips did not move. His eyes did not shift. The forest seemed to still around them, holding its breath. And then, as Pierce lifted his hat and attempted a greeting, he noticed something. The brown bowler hat Benjamin wore was unmistakable. A hat that had been worn before. A hat that belonged to someone who had vanished in these mountains months ago. The realization struck Pierce slowly at first, a creeping chill that began in his chest and spread outward. The hat belonged to a man whose letters had stopped, a man whose absence had puzzled his family, whose last known movements were traced to the very ridge where Pierce now stood. The forest, the clearing, the cabin, the three sons, they were all part of a stage set, one constructed over decades, and Pierce had unwittingly stepped onto it. Every instinct screamed that he should turn back, yet he could not. The rhythm of the ridge, the discipline of the cabin, the patient silence of Eliza and her sons, it all pressed toward him, inexorable, unyielding. For the first time in his life, Pierce felt the full weight of isolation. The mountains had swallowed others before him. The ridge had claimed lives quietly, with no trace. And now he was here, standing in the clearing, under the watchful eyes of those trained to see and anticipate every move. Each step he took carried him further into a world shaped by devotion, obedience, and a mother's absolute command. A world where time, morality, and the boundaries of human behavior were dictated not by law, but by the will of one woman and the shadows she had cultivated over decades. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The clearing became smaller, the trees closer, the shadows longer. And in that moment, Pierce understood what all those who vanished before him had failed to realize. The ridge did not forgive mistakes, did not allow intrusion, and was capable of keeping its secrets indefinitely, until the moment it chose to reveal them. Tonight, for the first time, we trace Pierce's final steps, not through ordinary danger, but into a world that had been hidden in plain sight, shaped by isolation, devotion, and an obedience that would shock the mountains themselves. His story is the story of the ridge, the cabin, the family, and the darkness that had waited 14 years to make itself known. The cabin of the Goins family stood at the center of the clearing like a sentinel, its logs blackened by decades of smoke, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of time, yet solid, unyielding, almost alive. Within, everything seemed deliberate, calculated, as if the house itself had been built not for comfort, but to maintain order, to hold the family's world together in perfect, rigid lines. The air inside smelled faintly of wood smoke, old pine, and something else. Something faintly metallic, like iron long forgotten. The kind of smell that clings to the mind before it can be named. The rooms were sparse, minimal, almost austere. Each item had its place. Chores were performed with precision. Nothing was wasted, nothing out of order. Beds were neatly made, utensils polished, and every tool lined along the walls as though expecting inspection at any moment. Light filtered in, only through narrow windows, creating long, thin shadows that stretched across the cabin floor and seemed to ripple with a life of their own. The very walls felt watchful, the floorboards attuned to every step, every shift of weight, every faint sound that echoed in the hollows beyond. And then there was the smokehouse, a small stone and wood structure, standing a few paces from the main cabin. It was ordinary at first glance, a place to cure meat and store provisions. But in the silence of the ridge, in the attention of those who had watched and waited for years, the ordinary became extraordinary. The floorboards were tight, almost unyielding, but careful eyes and careful hands could detect a hollow note under the weight of a foot. Something lay beneath, pressed into the earth, waiting for discovery. It was here, in this unremarkable building, that the true horror of the Goins family would finally emerge. Deputy Harland, one of the few men who had been trained to look beyond what the eye could see, knelt slowly, lantern trembling slightly in his grasp. He pried at the boards, each creak echoing like a distant scream in the still air. Beneath the planks lay cloth, rotted and moth-eaten, but arranged carefully, almost reverently. And then, beneath the cloth, came the shapes that defied comprehension. The skeletal remains of 2 infants, delicate as autumn leaves, their tiny bones folded and wrapped with meticulous care. The smell of earth and decay rose, mingling with the smoke of the cabin, a scent so strong that it pressed against the lungs and filled the mind with an understanding too horrifying to fully process. Sheriff Compton moved slowly into the smokehouse, every step deliberate, every breath measured. He had seen death before, men felled by accident, by violence, by disease, but nothing like this. The silence of the ridge, the stillness of the cabin, the careful, almost ceremonial placement of the remains, it all spoke of a devotion warped into something entirely human, and yet beyond understanding. It was a tableau of obedience, of faith twisted into action, of a mother's absolute control over life and death. And Eliza Goins sat nearby, as calm as if she were observing a lesson rather than the uncovering of her family's most guarded secret. Her eyes, sharp and unflinching, followed every movement. She spoke quietly, explaining with serene conviction that these children were sacred, that they had been offered in service to a purpose higher than the world outside the ridge could comprehend. Her words were not those of guilt or shame. They were those of a teacher, a prophet, a woman who had shaped her sons and her home into instruments of an idea so complete that the mountains themselves seemed to bend around it. The ridge, the cabin, the smokehouse, all had conspired to conceal this truth for 14 years. The disappearances, the isolation, the meticulous order of the home. It had all been a prelude, a preparation, a shadow play of control and devotion. And now, as light from the lanterns flickered across the tiny bones, the first tangible proof of the horrors hidden in the forest was revealed, confirming what no one had wanted to believe, but what everyone feared might be possible. This was a place where obedience had been taught from birth, where devotion had been transformed into ritual, and where the natural order had been supplanted by the absolute will of one woman. And the ridge waited, patient as ever, its secrets finally beginning to breathe in the open, its long-held silence breaking under the weight of discovery. Eliza Goins sat on the wooden bench just beyond the smokehouse, her figure outlined by the early morning sun, unshaken, unafraid. Her sons were restrained nearby, silent, obedient even in chains. The deputies moved cautiously, as if afraid that even a sudden movement could shatter the fragile balance of the clearing. The sheriff approached her, every step measured, yet the woman's gaze never faltered. There was no denial, no tremor, only a steady, unwavering presence that seemed to radiate authority into the very air. She spoke quietly, her voice calm and deliberate, carrying a weight that silenced the men around her. She told of a vision, of a divine calling that had arrived after the death of her husband. She explained that she had been shown a truth that the outside world could not comprehend, a sacred purpose that required the absolute devotion of her sons. To outsiders, her words sounded impossible, insane, incomprehensible. But within the context of the cabin, the ridge, the years of isolation, they became a form of logic, a system of morality that existed entirely within the boundaries she had constructed. The world, she said, does not understand purity. It corrupts everything it touches. But we are chosen. Our blood is sacred. Our line must remain untarnished. The mountains guard us because they recognize the importance of our work. Our obedience is proof. Our devotion is the covenant. She described the children beneath the smokehouse with a reverence that was impossible to ignore. Each infant, born of the unions she orchestrated between herself and her sons, had been, in her mind, the purest manifestation of her purpose. Their brief lives, their fragile bodies, had been honored, prepared for ascension. They were never lost, she whispered. They were offered. They returned to the heavens as they were meant to. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of her words pressing down on them, on the sheriff, on the very mountains themselves. There was no malice in her tone, only certainty, a conviction that stretched beyond human comprehension. As she spoke, it became clear that this was not a household of simple cruelty, but of ideology, a system of belief that had been shaped and reinforced over decades. Her sons were instruments, perfectly molded to follow her will, their understanding of morality overwritten by devotion. Caleb, Josiah, and Benjamin had never known a world beyond the ridge. The forest, the cabin, the rules of their mother, these had been their only constants. To them, the acts they had committed were not evil, nor even unusual. They were sacred, righteous, necessary. The psychological weight of obedience had transformed them into extensions of Eliza's mind, her philosophy, her purpose. Outside the clearing, the mountains remained silent witnesses. The wind stirred the trees as though breathing for the first time in years, carrying whispers that no human ear could fully understand. In the distance, birds began their cautious songs, hesitant in the presence of the hidden horrors now brought into light. The ridge, once patient, now trembled with revelation. 14 years of secrecy, isolation, and devotion had come to the surface, revealing a psychological horror that exceeded any physical terror. It was not just the murders, the disappearances, or the infants beneath the smokehouse. It was the architecture of belief itself, the total subjugation of human lives to an idea. Sheriff Compton, experienced in the darkest corners of human behavior, listened, recording, absorbing every word. He had faced criminals of all kinds, men who killed for greed, for rage, for power. But here was something beyond ordinary crime. Here was a mind that had reshaped reality itself, bending children into instruments of ideology, convincing them that unspeakable acts were holy, that death and life were tools in a sacred plan. The mountains had concealed it, the community had ignored it, and now it stood revealed, its logic impenetrable to all but those who had lived it. The psychological horror of the ridge extended beyond what anyone could witness. The forest had been a partner in secrecy, the cabin a stage, the smokehouse a vault. The Goins family had created a world where right and wrong were defined not by law or morality, but by obedience, devotion, and the conviction that God had sanctioned their every action. And as the sheriff and his deputies moved carefully through the clearing, absorbing the weight of truth, the mountains seemed to press closer, reminding all present that the horror was not in the discovery. It was in the understanding, the comprehension of how devotion could be weaponized against innocence itself. And so, the ridge waited. The story of Eliza Goins, her sons, and the years of obedience and isolation would soon reach the wider world. Yet the mountains held their silence still, keeping some of the weight, some of the memory, within the hollows, among the trees, and in the shadows where light would not reach. The day of the arrest on Goins Ridge began like any other in the mountains, with mist curling along the hollows, dew clinging to the trees, and the forest seeming to hold its breath. Yet, for the men who rode up the narrow trail, Sheriff Compton and his deputies, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Years of unanswered questions, years of vanished travelers and whispered fears, all converged at this single moment. Every footfall toward the cabin carried the weight of history, the accumulated dread of 14 years of silence. The sons emerged from the cabin as they always had, shoulders squared, eyes fixed, their bodies a testament to years of training under a single, unyielding authority. They did not resist. They did not speak. Their mother, Eliza, appeared calm, her figure framed by the doorway, the sun illuminating the stern, unshakable line of her face. She spoke quietly to her sons, and with an almost imperceptible gesture, they stepped aside. The sheriff and deputies entered the cabin with caution, their lanterns illuminating the austere interior, the carefully arranged tools and utensils, the rooms that held the echoes of a world apart from any civilization beyond the forest. The smokehouse was examined again, the boards pried up slowly, revealing once more the skeletal remains of the infants, wrapped with the same meticulous care, their fragility a stark contrast to the power wielded by those who had placed them there. Each discovery deepened the horror, confirmed the suspicions, and yet it was Eliza's presence that made the moment unbearable. She did not flinch, did not tremble, did not hesitate. She explained her actions with serene, unwavering logic. The children, she insisted, were sacred. The disappearances, she said, were acts of protection, acts of preservation, sanctioned by a law higher than any earthly court could comprehend. Once removed from the ridge and placed in custody, the Goins family became the center of a storm that stretched far beyond the mountains. News of their crimes spread rapidly, carried by train and carriage to the county seat, then across the state. The trial became a sensation, drawing reporters, lawyers, and onlookers from across Virginia. Every detail of the cabin, the ridge, the disappearances, and the smokehouse was recounted. Witnesses testified, sheriffs and deputies gave their accounts, and the mountains themselves seemed to whisper through every narrative, a haunting reminder of the isolation that had made this horror possible. Inside the courtroom, Eliza Goins maintained her composure. She answered questions with calm precision, explaining her beliefs, her actions, her devotion to the divine plan she had followed for decades. The jury listened, the spectators shivered, and the weight of comprehension settled over the room. The sons remained silent, their devotion to their mother unbroken even in chains. Caleb, Josiah, and Benjamin had been shaped so completely by her will that even the stark reality of their crimes could not disrupt the obedience that had defined their lives. The evidence presented was overwhelming. Personal effects of missing travelers, the skeletal remains of infants, the detailed confessions, all laid bare in a courtroom unprepared for the scale and psychological depth of the horrors revealed. And yet, beyond the physical evidence, the true terror lay in understanding the system Eliza Goins had constructed, the complete subjugation of mind and body, the transformation of love into control, of devotion into a mechanism for horror. It was a horror not merely of death, but of ideology made flesh, lived daily for decades in the shadow of mountains that bore witness in silence. As the trial progressed, the stories of the ridge, the cabin, the smokehouse, and the disappearances coalesced into a narrative so extreme, so incomprehensible, that the spectators struggled to process it. It was not merely a tale of murder. It was the story of obedience so absolute that reason itself was powerless, of devotion so total that innocence was sacrificed without hesitation, and of a mother whose will had become law in a clearing at the edge of civilization. The mountains, timeless and enduring, stood as mute witnesses, their shadows long and their hollows deep, concealing the memory of deeds that would haunt the region for generations. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint echoes of the ridge, the cabin, the smokehouse. For those who had known the family and those who had merely heard the stories, the realization sank in. The horror had been hidden in plain sight, preserved in isolation, and shaped by devotion. And even as the gavel fell, even as the court pronounced its judgments, the mountains kept a silence that could never be broken, guarding secrets that only time and memory could hold, a reminder of the shadow of Goins Ridge and the lives forever marked by what had occurred there. The courtroom was thick with anticipation on the day the verdicts were read. The air, heavy with the scent of wood polish and the faint tang of fear, seemed to press down on everyone present. Eliza Goins, seated with an eerie calm, watched silently as her sons, Caleb and Josiah, stood, bound in chains, their posture unwavering, their eyes reflecting the same obedience that had defined every moment of their lives on the ridge. Benjamin, weakened by illness, had already succumbed to tuberculosis, leaving the youngest absent from the proceedings. Yet his shadow lingered in the minds of those who remembered the family as more than just a household. They were an institution of control, devotion, and terror. The jury, confronted with overwhelming evidence, deliberated briefly. It was not the murder of travelers, nor the infants buried beneath the smokehouse, that shocked them most. It was the architecture of belief, the complete dominance of one mind over others, and the absolute submission of 3 grown men to a doctrine that redefined morality itself. In less than 3 hours, they returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. The sentences were pronounced swiftly, a formal echo of justice meted out against a backdrop of mountains that had watched silently for decades. Caleb and Josiah Goins were sentenced to hang. The execution dates were set, the gallows constructed with a solemn precision, and the small community braced itself for the final act. On the mornings of their executions, the ridge seemed to hold its breath once more. Horses' hooves struck the ground with measured sound. Wind whispered through the hollows, and even the birds hesitated in their song. Caleb went first, his steps deliberate, his face calm, eyes meeting those of the sheriff with recognition, but no fear. He ascended the gallows with the same quiet obedience that had marked his entire life. The trapdoor opened, the noose took its hold, and a silence that was almost reverent followed. Josiah followed 3 weeks later, his demeanor identical, a final testament to the devotion his mother had instilled, an unbroken line of obedience, even to death. Eliza Goins was declared criminally insane and committed to the Southwestern State Hospital in Marion, Virginia. There, she remained for 8 years, a prisoner of the law but still a prophet in her own mind. She spent her days reading scripture, interpreting it according to her personal theology, attempting to convert those who came near to her interpretation of purity and divine purpose. Her voice, though contained within the walls of the hospital, echoed the same certainty that had guided every action on the ridge, a chilling reminder that ideology, when wielded without accountability, can surpass even the most brutal forms of physical control. The cabin, once the center of all that horror, remained empty for years. Locals avoided it, whispering warnings to their children, marking the location on maps of fear. And in 1924, the structure was consumed by fire. Whether the blaze was accidental or deliberate, no one knew. Yet the result was a symbolic cleansing. The smokehouse, the cabins, the very walls that had held the secrets of 14 years, now reduced to ash and memory. The mountains reclaimed the land, the forest grew dense again, and Goins Ridge became indistinguishable from the endless wilderness that surrounded it, hiding its shadows in plain sight. Today, the ridge stands quiet, overgrown, a place where hunters give a wide berth, and the wind whispers faintly through trees that have witnessed more than any human mind can fully comprehend. The story of the Goins family remains a cautionary tale, a warning about isolation, about unquestioning obedience, and about the terrible power of ideology when placed in the hands of a mind willing to reshape reality to suit its vision. The victims, whose names were long obscured, were finally remembered, their graves marked, their lives acknowledged. Yet the memory of their suffering persists in every hollow, every hollowed floorboard, every shadow of the mountains they once traversed. And so, the mountains remain, silent, patient, indifferent to time. The story of the Goins Ridge, of Eliza and her sons, is one of terror, born not of the supernatural, but of human devotion, taken to its extreme. The ridge waits still, for the wind to carry whispers, for the trees to murmur truths that were never meant to be forgotten. Its legacy is not just horror. It is a testament to the cost of looking away, to the danger of silence, and to the price paid when the boundaries of morality are surrendered to one mind, unchallenged, in the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains. The mountains of Appalachia hold their silence once more, and the shadows of Goins Ridge remain. If this story unsettled you, give this video a like, subscribe for more forgotten histories brought back to light, and share your thoughts below. Tell us where you're watching from and the time at your corner of the world. Every comment helps us remember that even in the shadows, we are not alone.